Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and check it out, I've got my switch machines working, and all my tracks are wired up, which is really satisfying. I mean, who doesn't love watching trains run? And we could do that all day, but let's check out what I did. I've already got dropper wires for power where the boards join each other, and that makes sense, but I figured it would be a good idea to add more to the ends, and that obviously required some soldering. I guess I could have used some of those power clip thingies you can get, but that probably would have had to be done before installing the track. So I solder the wires on. Pretty messily too. Soldering really isn't my strong suit. This is going to be a hidden area anyway, so messy doesn't really matter here. It is still a good idea to hide the wires a bit, or at least pass them through to the underside of the baseboard. That'll make it much easier to connect the other wires, and that's what I do. I've used thicker wire for the, I guess, bus wires, because apparently that's what you're meant to do. Also, it's the kind of wire that the local hardware had. Obviously, you've got to make sure that all of the wires are connected correctly, otherwise it's just not going to work. I've got red for the outside rails, and white on the inside of the loop. The colours don't really matter, as long as you're consistent. I connected all of the white wires to the other white wires, and red to red. I plan to use DCC, so it's all connected as one circuit. If you want to use DC and have more than one train running, you'll have to do a bit more work. It doesn't seem like a good idea to do all of that work and then not utilise it. Heat shrinking does seem like a good idea though. Not only will this prevent short circuits, it can also hide awful looking soldering jobs, if, like me, that's the kind of soldering jobs you do. Rather than leaving the wires hanging loose, I tape them to the underside of the board. This black tape is cheap gaffer's tape, and it's not very good at staying stuck, but it does hold the wires while I'm working on everything else. As you can see, I've drilled holes into the framework to pass wires through. You could drill bigger holes and pass multiple wires through, or you could use the bit that was already in your drill and make a single hole for each wire. Here, I'm passing this blue wire through some holes. This is for the point motors, because now it's time to connect all of those up. Again, I'm using thicker wires, though I've forgotten what size they are. This blue wire is, I guess you might call it a common wire, or something like that. It'll connect all of the green wires coming from the point motors, which will eventually lead to the negative terminal on the CDU. The hardware didn't have any green wire, so I'm using blue. I am a bit disappointed that it doesn't match, but the colour of the wire isn't really important, as long as you know what it is and where it should go. Then I connect up the black and red wires, with plenty of tape to hold it roughly in place. This is pretty simple, and I don't think I need to show you in depth how to connect wires up. You probably do a better job of it than me anyway. The only thing that's even slightly tricky about this is if you've got two point motors and you want to activate them at the same time. You obviously have to connect them so they throw the points the way you want them. I achieved this by connecting black wires to black wires and red to red, though you could do the opposite. The way I've done it, the machines will throw in the same direction, so to have both points which are facing each other both switch to diverging together, I mounted the motors facing opposite directions to each other. I labelled these A, as you can kind of see on the board, and it might seem obvious, but labelling things is a really good idea. Also, if you look closely, you can see that the wires are coming out of the machines on opposite sides. To be sure this is wired up properly, it's a good idea to test it before you do anything too permanent. Seeing this work was very satisfying. The nice thing with these point motors is that you can still flip them manually if you need to, or just want to. I don't envision needing to do that on this crossover, because the train will only derail if you've got one switch aligned against it, but you can if you want. Just look at this mess. I needed a way to connect the wires between the boards. This railway is intended to come apart, so a permanent connection would be a little bit silly. To make things slightly neater, and to make it easier to change things, I've used these terminal strips. I didn't have appropriately sized screws to mount them, and didn't fancy a trip to the hardware, so the heads are a little bit big, and when I screw the strip into place, it does deform a little bit, but that's probably okay. And it does stay there, which is the main thing. Then, I connect the wires. It's nice to not have to solder these. I am not a solder enjoyer. The order in which you connect the wires doesn't really matter, as long as they're consistent with both boards. I wrote down the order I connected mine in so that I wouldn't forget. This is especially important if you've got multiple wires of the same colour. The result is, well, it's still kinda messy, but it's a bit neater than it was before. Also, you can see that I've removed the black gaffer's tape and replaced it with purple duct tape. Not only is it a nicer colour, but duct tape should stick better than gaffer's tape, especially in the heat. Now it's time to figure out how to get the electricity from one board to the other. Plugs would be the way to do it. Specifically, I'm going to use these ones. I don't know what their name is, but I got them from Amazon, and I don't really know anything about this kind of thing, so I don't know if they're good. They were cheap though, and they seemed suitable. The problem with them is they've only got 5 wires, and I've got 9 wires that need connecting. The obvious solution is to use 2 of them, so that's what I do. The other problem is that the wires aren't long enough. So, more soldering. And now the wires are much longer. Probably a little bit too long for some people's tastes, and they're also different colours, but the colour doesn't really matter as long as you know which wire goes where. Connecting this up properly is very simple, and because the terminal strip is screw connections rather than soldering, if you do make a mistake, it's really easy to undo. It does look pretty messy, but everything is now connected correctly. First time as well. The reason I've got the wires for the connectors so long is that they are actually kind of hard to pull apart. I suspect this might be because they're waterproof. Having long wires means that when I force them apart, that I don't just rip them out of the board. I'll probably wrap these up in tape or something like that to make them look a bit neater, but for now, this is fine. The dog makes her inspection and decides she doesn't really care, but everything is done except for the controls, which will connect with this messy bundle of wires. You can see that I've labelled each pair of wires, which, as I keep saying, is a good idea. Anyway, I'm going to use this Peco switch holder console thing, mostly because I'm going to use the Peco passing contact switches. I'm sure you could make your own control panel to whatever level of fanciness you want, but I'm using this for simplicity. I went to the effort of drilling individual holes for the wires for each switch, though I didn't end up actually using that. I also made a diagram to be sure that I got the switches where I wanted them and controlling the points that I wanted them to control. And here are the switches. I was actually feeling a bit more confident with my soldering by this point, so I soldered the wires on, and I didn't destroy anything. Here's how that console looks with all the switches in place. The wires protrude a little bit further down than I wanted. Maybe this is a design flaw. Anyway, to make it fit, I hacked out a hole in the baseboard. It's messy, really messy, but that's okay. The console will cover it and it should look a little bit neater, at least from above. I'll screw that down later. As you can see here, I've made sure to add labels so I don't wire anything up wrong. Have I mentioned that it's a great idea to label things? No? Well, it is. I haven't shown myself doing any of the soldering because, well, I'm not good at it, and I'm definitely not the person you want to learn soldering from. I'm sure there's thousands of videos out there that you could watch if you want to learn soldering. It's not neat, or even 100% completed under here, but it's not as messy as it could be, and more importantly, it's functional. I am a simple man, so I find flipping the switch and having the points go thunk to be very satisfying. I've got the switches arranged in a way that makes sense to me. The yellow switch is for the passing track on the other side of the board, and the rest of them pretty much line up with the switches along the front of the board. Nothing fancy or complicated here. Flipping the switches is fun, but it's even more fun to run a train and flip switches. So while I do have a few more things to do, like screw down the switch console and mount the CDU properly, and I would also like to add some plugs for the power pack and CDU power so that I don't have to have them permanently connected. But for now, I've got enough done that it's functional as a model railway. I don't think the wiring I've done is especially complicated, but it was more time consuming than I'd expected, and I only had 9 point motors to connect. There are people with way more than that on their model railway. It's not hard to see why this hobby is a long-term one. I guess if I was doing it more and more I would probably get faster at it, and I was also deliberately not rushing, Rather, I was being careful to avoid making mistakes. While I am more confident in my soldering abilities now, it's still not something I especially enjoy. My wiring is pretty messy, and I'm sure there are some people out there who are very upset that I haven't used some sort of fancy wire retaining clips or something, but I just don't care. I built a model railway, not a wiring display. Also, I'm kind of thinking of the wiring as semi-temporary. I don't know where I'm going to put the structures, and I would like to have lighting in most of them, so I'll have to drill some holes for that, and if there are any wires where I need to drill, ideally I'd be able to move them. Seems like a sensible thing to me. Anyway, now I've got a functional model railway. Mostly. I do still need to add some track in the middle, but that's going to go hand in hand with the structures and figuring out their placement, so that might not be the next step, and there are a lot of other things to do, so I'm not sure what's going to be next, but it will be something, so stick around. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comments section below. If you haven't already done so, why not subscribe here on YouTube for the low price of absolutely nothing? I hear it's what all the cool kids are doing, and you want to be one of the cool kids, don't you? If you want to be extra cool, and you've got the means, and you want to help a Herbert Erpaderp do Herbert Erpaderp things, like build a model railway, and not starve, and see the videos a little bit early before there's any ads, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to Patreon, and all of my other things like Discord and social media, in the description below. I'll be back soon, so until then, take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.